Liberty Fund welcomes you to a series of 3 conversations with Professor Gary Becker, in which he is joined by 3 different colleagues for a wide-ranging discussion of some of the most important aspects of his work. In our first conversation, Professor Becker discusses changes in the economics profession over the years and his role in extending economic analysis beyond its traditional areas of concern. Professor Becker is joined in this conversation by Edward Glaeser, professor of economics at Harvard University.
The common view, I think, in the profession is that economics over the past 50 years has really changed radically. In 1950, so the common view goes, economics was defined by its subject matter. It was about markets, it was about currencies, it was about well-defined transactions involving cash. In 2002, I was just up until 2 a.m. in the morning studying hatred, and I'm not, I'm not uncommon for an economist. Yeah. So we've changed really from being a field about subject to being a field about methodology, to being a field about approach. And of course, certainly the general view is that you were the great figure moving us along that change. But before we get into your role in this, how true is the common view about what 1950 was like? I mean, if we go back 50 years ago, right, to what extent is that sort of view that it was not about methodology, it was about subject matter? Is that true?
I think it is largely true. I came into Chicago as a graduate student in 1951, and the field of economics at that time was mainly devoted to what I would call traditional economic subjects, supply and demand for different products and services. Stock market a little, there wasn't really much systematic analysis of stock market, some macroeconomic type of policy. Keynesian economics was already in place then, so there's a lot of discussion of macroeconomic policies, international trade policies. The basic theory of international trade was already established. But if you ask what was the scope of economics, it was extremely limited. And when people began to work on questions that broaden that scope, they were said to be doing not economic type of work. I mean, by the leading figures in the economics profession.
But not Smith, right? I mean, when Smith talks about this stuff, it's the same economic lens being turned on everything.
Smith was different. Smith and many other of the classical economists took a very broad view of economics and used similar reasoning. That vanished as the field became more technical and refined. And with each technical step, it became narrower and narrower.
Right. I mean, your dissertation, The Economics of Discrimination, is, of course, really, it's a seminal work. It's a seminal work on the fusion of novel preferences and the market. And what's so remarkable about it is it's not just about, people discriminating each other. It's about how that's going to actually happen in a market, in a market transaction. I think actually a lot of modern work on behavioral economics actually just focuses on the unusual preferences and actually doesn't ask how that's going to actually play out in a market.
Well, I think I got the topic originally from something Milton Friedman had said. I can't remember all the details. And then I went home and started thinking about discrimination. I think he set some problem in discrimination. I went home and I started thinking about it, and I came up with the idea of a discrimination coefficient. That excited me greatly because I felt now I had a handle to discuss this problem. The next thing I wanted to do, and you're absolutely right about that, was to see how market forces affected the distinction between what I called the taste for discrimination and market discrimination. And I think if there's a main theme of my book, it's that you cannot go easily and automatically from one to the other, that there are many forces that will influence how individual tastes for discrimination play out in the market. And so I try to do that as best I can, bring in monopoly, competition, consumer-level choices, and government. I even have a little 2-page discussion of how government will influence the amount of discrimination.
I actually agree with you that to me at least the most special thing about your thesis is the fact that the taste for discrimination doesn't necessarily work out one-for-one to discrimination. That the presence of just a few non-discriminatory entrepreneurs can actually mean that the impact of wildly discriminatory entrepreneurs is totally muted.
Absolutely.
But the thing guys remember most about this, which is clearly related to thinking about this in a market setting, but it's a little bit different. And I think actually ultimately, less seminal than the other insight, is the fact that discrimination is in a sense costly. Right. So the thing that if you asked most graduate students what they remember about the economics of discrimination, it's that having discriminatory tastes actually carries a cost. And when you think about it, it's obvious that maximizing cash is going to bring you more cash than maximizing cash subject to a discrimination constraint or subject to a taste for discrimination. How surprising was that in the time? How surprising was this insight?
Well, it's hard for me to know. People didn't really bother to think systematically about discrimination, either in economics or in sociology, any other field.
But there was this thing that sort of discrimination was a conspiracy of businessmen or
the
to
Marxists
increase profits or
had
something.
that
There was
theory.
some.
I have a number of references to the Marxist literature. That was a conspiracy theory that capitalists discriminated in order to keep down and extract some more rents from the workers. That was a Marxist theory, and I have some quotes in it where it's very blatant, very open about what it was. So they had paid some attention to it. If you look within the economic sphere, I remember when I was telling Milton Friedman about the work on discrimination, his initial instinct was to rebel against it, because he had suffered a lot, he felt, from discrimination, which I'm sure he did in the 30s and so on. He had difficulty getting jobs and so on.
Right.
And so when I said, well, discrimination is a preference, you have to look at how it operates in the market, he didn't like that cold, way of analyzing. But very shortly, he saw, yeah, this seems to be the right way of doing it. It was one of my strongest supporters, and was on my dissertation, was a very strong supporter of what I did. So I think, economists didn't think about it very much. Marxists did, but they weren't in the mainstream of economics. Sociologists didn't think of costs. And I think what I tried to do is say, yes, discrimination is a preference. It has a cost. You have to give up something. And people might be willing to give it up, but how their willingness to give it up versus the entry of people with different willingnesses, the conditions under which people can enter, either through open competition or indirect competition by buying out a monopolist or through the political process, all that is relevant. But the fact that it is a cost means that if you have an open competitive system, that's going to reduce the amount of discrimination that you will see. And so free market people like that implication of it. I think it's a correct implication, but they like that implication that markets sort of cut into discrimination. I think there's a lot of truth to it. Now, the problem is, I made the point, and I still believe it's a correct point, that yes, it cuts into it, but there's no reason to believe that markets will eliminate discrimination. It may make it less than it would be. You have more competition as opposed to monopoly. I show under some conditions you're going to get less discrimination. All that's relevant, but that doesn't mean you end up with zero discrimination.